Hi everyone, you made it. This is our last video on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This one is about the conclusion of his argument as found in Book 10. So we know that the big question that Aristotle is considering in his Nicomachean Ethics is what is the goal or purpose or end of human life? And he thinks the simple answer to this is that happiness is the goal or purpose or end of human life. It's the thing that we want more than anything else, and it's the thing that we do everything else for. But he thinks the harder question is figuring out what happiness is. He thinks that there's a lot of disagreement. He thinks there's a lot of mistakes being made about what happiness is. As I said, there are two ways to ask the question, what is happiness? First, we can ask, in what does happiness consist? In other words, we can ask, what are the key ingredients? What are the key features? If happiness is something that we cook up, what's the recipe? How much of each thing do we need? And what should we leave out if we want it to taste better, so to speak? The other way to ask the question about what is happiness is to ask about it more holistically. What does the happy life look like? What is the ideal that we should be striving for? What should we be modeling our lives toward or against? And this is the second question is the one that he's considering most in Book 10. We saw that him give something like, we've been seeing him give something like key ingredients to happiness throughout the Nicomachean Ethics. The first time he did this is when he gave his six-part definition of happiness in section 7 of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he said that happiness is an excellent activity of the soul involving reason in accord with virtue over a complete life. There he identifies some key ingredients. Some of the most important ones are using your reason and growing in virtue. Later on, he also emphasized that packed into virtue is this notion of taking pleasure in the right sorts of things and having the right sorts of pleasures in your life. And later on, we also saw that friendship, he thinks, is a key component of the happy life. So we're sort of building up a kind of recipe for happiness. But what about the second question? What about what does the happy life look like? And what should our lives look like if we really want to live full, deep, meaningful, fulfilling human lives? In Book 1, he started this discussion by talking about other lives that he thinks do not meet the requirements for a life, are not the best sorts of lives that we can live. Plenty of people live them, but he thinks that they're mistaken about whether they will make them happy or whether they are in fact making them happy. Some people might be living them and think, yeah, I've never been happier. But Aristotle gave philosophical reasons for why those people would be mistaken. What's his answer? What sort of life does he think that we should be living? Remember, in Book 1, he considered something called the life of indulgence, which took pleasure to be the key to happiness. He considered something called the political life, which takes honor or reputation or respect to be the key to happiness. He considered something called the moneymaker's life, which takes wealth to be the key to happiness. He mentioned the contemplative life, but didn't say anything about it in Book 1. And he also mentioned this other life, which we called maybe something like the life of passive virtue, which takes the possession of certain good qualities to be the key to happiness. He found all of them lacking for one reason or another. He gave philosophical arguments for why he thinks that, in principle, none of those ways of living your life can make you happy, whoever you are, because they couldn't make any human being happy. They wouldn't respect human nature. They wouldn't respect what makes us the kind of thing that we are. So his approach in Book 10 is to take a step back and to consider all of the possible lives, or at least the main ones, that people could live, different ways that people could live their lives, or in fact do live their lives, and then identify also a list of various conditions or criteria that any life would have to meet in order to count as the truly happy life for a human being. So what he's going to work up to is sort of two lists. The one list is going to be the candidates, right? The kinds of lives that we could choose to live. And then the second list is going to be his conditions or criteria. How do we evaluate these various lives to figure out which is the one that we ought to live? And so once we come up with a list of criteria and come up with a list of candidates, we can weigh each of the candidates according to the criteria that he's come up with and evaluate them to see which of the lives is the one that's most likely to lead us to the most complete, most fulfilling kind of happiness that we're capable of. So most of these criteria are from his definition in Book 1, but they also are from some of the other discussions that we've seen elsewhere. Let me run through the criteria or the conditions that he thinks any life would have to meet in order to be the happy life. And he thinks each of these conditions or criteria are ones that anyone would seem like good criteria or good conditions. It does seem that what I want out of life is something that meets all of these conditions. So the first criterion or condition for the best sort of life is that it ought to be based on some sort of good that is itself complete. And what do we mean by complete is that it has to be an end in itself, not done for the sake of some further end. If a life is based on some good that is only a means to a further end and not an end in itself, that's an indication that that life is mistaken, that will never really bring true happiness. The second condition or criterion is that it ought to be based on a good that is itself self-sufficient. And what does it mean for a good to be self-sufficient? For a good to be self-sufficient means that it does not need anything else in order to be complete, in order to get its goodness. What's the difference between completeness and self-sufficiency then? Completeness, I want to say, is something like a vertical notion. Completeness means that it's the end, right? It is the highest. There is nothing further that it is pursued for the sake of. Self-sufficiency is a bit more like a horizontal notion. It's about whether if you had this thing, that would be all that you need right now. You wouldn't need anything else in your life at this moment in order to be happy, right? What you want is to base your life around something that is both complete and self-sufficient. What's an example of a self-sufficient good? Well, here's an example of something that's not a self-sufficient good. Most often a video game is not a self-sufficient good. So you can imagine, for example, right, that next Christmas, Grandma gets you a brand new Xbox game. And you think, wow, Grandma, that's fantastic. What a great gift. Thanks so much for giving me the Xbox game. But you don't tell her this, but you're thinking that, oh, darn, I just sold my Xbox. What you've just realized is that this game, while it's good, it's not a self-sufficient good. You can't get the goodness out of it on its own. Even if you had it, right, that's not enough. You also need the console, and you need some electricity. Maybe you even need some friends to play it with. Whereas on the other hand, right, Nintendo came up with this really nice idea to try to make it even more self-sufficient, video games that is. So they came up with these classic NESs or classic Super Nintendos that have the games preloaded in them. You still need electricity, of course, and you still need TV, right? But it's more self-sufficient than just either one of them on their own. You have the console and the games built right into it. All by itself, it can get more of the goodness, right? So what you should be basing your life on then is something that is both complete and self-sufficient. He also thinks that in order for a life to truly be happy, it would also have to involve an activity. We saw this come up a few times. He thinks that happiness is not just a passive state. It's not just something that happens to you. It's something that you're doing. It's something that you're participating in. So in order for something to be a happy life, it would have to involve you doing something and not just something happening to you. The fourth condition or criterion is that the good or the goods that your life is based on ought to be continuous, long-lasting, and durable, and stable, indeed. You should be focusing on those things that last, things that are stable, cannot be easily taken away if you really want to have the deepest, truest, most complete kind of happiness of which you're capable. The fifth condition is that your life ought to include the appropriate pleasures. As we saw last time, Aristotle does think that pleasure has some role to play in the happy life. He thinks that if you didn't have any kind of pleasures, then you would be missing something. Your life would be incomplete in some way. And so he thinks in order to really live a truly happy life, then there has to be pleasures involved in some way. And we know based on our discussion last time where he thinks exactly those pleasures should fit in and which pleasures should fit in. The last condition, or the last criterion, is actually one we might have put first. This is the idea that whatever your life is based on, if you really want to truly be happy, it better involve you fulfilling your function, living up to your full potential, utilizing your highest capacities. This was his major critique of several lives that we've seen already, especially the life of indulgence. He thinks that it fails to be the best sort of life we can live because it doesn't help us to fulfill our function. It doesn't involve us fulfilling our function. Our lives would be incomplete, and we will feel unfulfilled and be unfulfilled if we are not utilizing our highest capacities, which are, he thinks, principally our capacity for rationality, our reason. Okay. So that is the list of conditions or criteria that any life would have to meet in order to count as the best life. Are they sensible? Do they make sense? They seem to. It seems like, yeah, if we were figuring out what sort of life we should live, we should be looking at these various dimensions. We look, ideally, yes, I would want something. I would want my life, and then what I'm basing my life on to meet all of those conditions. So taking those conditions, right, sort of, if I were to draw this on the board, I've got on the left side, right, I've got the criteria or the conditions. And now we want to bring in the second chart, which is the list of the candidates for the highest good. You can imagine this as a kind of game show, right? Let's meet our contestants. What are the sorts of lives that we could live? We're going to try to figure out which one is deserving of our lives and which ones are the ones that we should actually pursue. So here are the candidates for the highest good or the happiest life that we could pursue, ways in which people actually seem to live their lives. Well, 5 of them we actually already know from Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. There is the life of indulgence, which takes pleasure to be the highest good. There is the political life, which takes honor to be the highest good. And once again, the political life is just about honor and reputation. It doesn't have to be a life of politics. It's just anybody who takes to be the highest good, to be how you are perceived by others. You evaluate how well your life is going based on how other people view you. The third candidate is that there is a life of passive virtue, according to which just having good qualities is taken to be the highest good and the best sort of life. There is the moneymaker's life, which takes wealth to be the key to happiness. And we also mentioned in Book 1 is something called the contemplative life. But we don't know anything about that life yet. We're going to learn a little bit more about that life in Book 10. He mentions a couple other ones in Book 2, we saw at least one other sort of life that you could live. Not a life of passive virtue, but a life of active virtue, according to which the highest good is not just having good qualities, but acting on them, not just being generous, but acting generously. And then, arguably, there are 2 more candidates that he considers in Book 10. You can let me know whether you think they're actually in there or whether I'm reading into this too much. But we might see something like a life of power described in what he talks about. He talks about those who are in power and what they take to be important. It might be that the way in which you could live your life is according to which you evaluate how well your life is going based on how much control you have, not just over your life, but over the lives of others. You want power, you want influence, you want authority. That's a kind of political life, but it's not in terms of the honor or respect. You don't care about whether people honor or respect you, but you want them, right, to obey you, or you want them to perhaps even fear you. You want to have the ultimate sort of power. And this doesn't have to be sort of evil, right? Maybe you just want to be the boss. You just want to be the head of some company. That's what you want. And your life won't be complete or fulfilled until you get into that position of power or authority. Another kind of life that he mentions is something I would like to call the life of amusement. In this sort of life, what is taken to be the key or the highest good are leisurely activities. So it is a kind of life based on pleasure, but it's different from the life of indulgence. Here's how. I think the life of indulgence, where it takes pleasure to be the highest good, is a kind of really active, sort of high flying. It's the life of the party goer, right? What they want are these really intense and sort of active pleasures. They're looking for more and different ones all the time. Whereas a life of amusement is more about these kind of passive pleasures, where it takes something like relaxation to be the best sort of good. It's when you take as the key to happiness, right? Just sort of relaxing, right? And sort of enjoying, right? A sort of peaceful sort of life. Maybe that's how we'd understand the life of amusement. If you sort of think that the key to happiness is sort of sitting down with a cold pop and a hot dog at the ball game, right? If you think that's sort of the pinnacle of human happiness, then that's a life of amusement. Or if you think that the pinnacle of human happiness is taking the camper out and camping, right, and sitting around the campfire late into the night and enjoying some s'mores, that's a life of amusement, not sort of intense and really active pleasures, but more like sort of passive pleasure, just sort of relaxing and enjoying. If you think that's the pinnacle of human happiness, right, then you're pursuing a life of amusement. It's anyone who thinks that their real life happens on the weekends is living a life of amusement. They're not really interested in their work, but where their life really begins is when they get to stop doing work and do what they really enjoy. Or someone who's living entirely and working entirely for the sake of what they hope to do when they retire. notice that what they're taking to be important is not what they do in their job, but when they're able to relax afterwards in retirement, they're taking that as the ultimate goal. That's happiness. Happiness doesn't happen now, it'll happen later when I don't have to work and I can just relax. Put all together, then, I count maybe 8 candidates, 8 contestants that could be worthy of our lives. There's the life of indulgence, there's the political life, the life of passive virtue, the moneymaker's life, the life of power, the life of amusement, the life of active virtue, and the contemplative life. Ultimately, and sort of here's the punchline, Aristotle thinks that 2 of these lives do way better than all the others with respect to the conditions or the criteria for the best life. Did you catch which ones those are? The 2 that he thinks are the finalists, the ones that he thinks that do the best here, are the life of active virtue and the contemplative life. No surprise there, given that he spent so much talking about the importance of virtue and living virtuously, and no surprise about the contemplative life, because that's the one he mentioned in book 1, but it said we'll talk about that later. He didn't give any objection to that life there, which was kind of an indication that, okay, it looks like that's going to be a pretty strong competitor. So I think that there are 2 finalists. Those 2 make it to the final round. Why are all the other ones knocked out of the running? Well, because they fail to meet one or more of the criteria or conditions. And we've seen a bit of how each of these candidates does this already. So, for example, he thinks that the life of indulgence, where pleasure is taken to be the highest good, doesn't properly respect or fulfill our function. It might be that pleasure isn't a self-sufficient good. It might not be continuous or long-lasting. We saw that political life, which takes honor to be the highest good, his major complaint was that it wasn't self-sufficient, right? Is that it depended too much on other people and could be easily taken away when they change their mind, even if you're not doing anything differently. We saw that he didn't like the life of passive virtue because it wasn't properly active. And we saw that he didn't like the moneymaker's life because money isn't an end in itself, it's merely a means. And he goes through the rest of these, right, and describes the various ways in which they fail to meet various conditions or criteria. And in fact, going through this and looking at his argument for why he thinks some lives are better than others based on these conditions or criteria is going to be the topic for your second argument analysis essay, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But I'm also going to open up. Usually I would open this up to discussion in the classroom. I would have you sort of play the matching game. Think about any of the other candidates and some of the other conditions or criteria that those candidates fail to meet to see whether it lines up with what Aristotle's conclusion is going to be. But I'm going to open this up as a discussion topic. You're going to be writing about this with your essay, but feel free to share some of your ideas. Like, wait a second, I think this life might fail on this count as well. What do others think about that? Or what do you think about that, Dr. S? It's a way of sort of practicing some of your answers as you're working on your essay. So open up that discussion topic after I finish with this video. But before I get to talking about the second argument analysis essay, and before you get going on jumping into this discussion topic about what candidates fail to meet which conditions or criteria, I want to talk a little bit more about the 2 lives that he thinks are the finalists. The life of active virtue and the contemplative life. Now, we know a bit about the life of active virtue because that's just the life that's described in book 2. It's the life in which you have practiced certain things in order to condition your dispositions, you've conditioned your pleasures, and you have aimed for all of the right sorts of character traits that he describes in detail in the middle books. That's what that life looks like. Well, what is the contemplative life? He hasn't said anything about it until we get to book 10. Here's what he says about the contemplative life in book 10. The highest good of the contemplative life, he says, is developing your mind, is developing your reason. It's contemplating these deep sorts of truths. You'll notice a key word when he describes the contemplative life in book 10. What he says that the contemplative life is focused on is something called theoretical wisdom. Now, he doesn't tell us what theoretical wisdom is in book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, but we have heard of theoretical wisdom from some other work that we read from Aristotle. Anyone remember what other work from Aristotle that we read talked about theoretical wisdom? Time's up. It's the Metaphysics. When we talked about book 1, part 1 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, where he gives his theory of knowledge, we saw that he outlines various stages of knowledge that human beings can achieve. And he talked about how some forms or states of knowledge are superior to others, and he went all the way up to the top of the chart where he identified what he thinks is the highest form of knowledge, the highest cognitive state that human beings can be in. And what was that highest sort of state of knowledge, that highest cognitive states that human beings can be in? You guessed it, it's theoretical wisdom. And so what is theoretical wisdom? He doesn't tell us in the Nicomachean Ethics, but he does tell us in Book 1 of the Metaphysics. What does he tell us there? Uh, as you recall, right, he works through sensation is the first kind of faculty we have, then memory, then experience, and then something he calls art or science, where we form a judgment, we make a universal judgment about some particular class of things. But then he also thinks, right, we get to this next level of wisdom, in which not only are you able to form universal judgments and contemplate these universal natures, but you're able to better understand the relationship between these natures, these universal concepts, such that your knowledge of the world is getting deeper and deeper and deeper. You not only have some experience with different kinds of things, you not only know how to recognize them, but you know how things are connected at a deeper level. You're starting to understand the kind of laws of nature, not just how particular things are related to one another, but how their natures are related to one another, such that individuals behave in the way that they do. That's when you've reached the point of wisdom. But he says that there are two kinds of wisdom. There is practical wisdom, in which you're using this better knowledge of how these natures are related to one another for some practical use, like a doctor uses his knowledge of what cures what kind of illness to help patients. But at a certain point, Aristotle says that your knowledge will get so deep, so fundamental, so abstract, that it'll cease to be practically beneficial. This is when we're in the realm of theoretical wisdom. It's like when the theoretical physicist comes into some deeper understanding of subatomic particles. Is that going to help him pay the bills? Is that going to help him cure cancer? Maybe not. But it is going to reach a further depth of knowledge for human beings than we were capable of before. And so this is theoretical wisdom. It's the point at which you are delving deeper in your knowledge of the world, not for the sake of some practical benefit, but solely for the sake, it becomes, of just understanding our place in the world and the nature of the world that we're in. So it's no longer about the practical benefit. It becomes about just knowing, about just having a deeper understanding of the world. So connect this to the discussion of Nicomachean Ethics. In the contemplative life, the highest good, the focus of your life, should be developing theoretical wisdom. And from Book 1 of the Metaphysics, we know that what he's saying here is that this sort of life develops and focuses on the greatest form of knowledge that you can achieve, in which you are considering and coming to better know how these universal natures are related to one another, not for the sake of some practical benefit. You've gotten even more deep in your knowledge than that, but solely for the sake of understanding how the world works and your place in it. And so the contemplative life is a life that's dedicated to that kind of study, to developing your mind to such an extent that what you're really after is just a deeper and deeper understanding of the world and our place in it. It's the life of the mind. So roughly, the life of active virtue is kind of a life of service. It's a life in which you go out there in the world and make it a better place. You develop your virtue and you help other people. The contemplative life, on the other hand, is the life of the mind. So it's not a life of service, but it's a life of the mind. It's one in which you pursue, for the sake of humanity as well, right, greater and greater knowledge of our world and our place in it. So who can be said to live a life like that? I said maybe someone like the theoretical physicist or other scientists can live a contemplative sort of life, as long as what they're interested in is just a better understanding of our world and not for the sake of any practical benefit. Other people who could be said to live a contemplative life, well, here's one, right? When he describes a contemplative life, Aristotle, of course, is not within the Christian tradition, but the way that he describes a contemplative life sounds a lot like a sort of religious life in which you are dedicated to contemplating deep truths about the nature of God and our relationship to God. So who can live a contemplative life? Scientists can, religious can. I want to say also philosophers can, right? Insofar as philosophers, especially philosophers, are interested in things like metaphysics or understanding deep truths about morality. These are the ones that are living a contemplative life, a life of the mind in pursuit, not of glory, not of pleasure, not of power, not of honor, right? But just greater and greater knowledge of wisdom, of greater understanding, which is an end in itself, Aristotle says. And so Aristotle thinks that the life of active virtue and the contemplative life, now that we have at least a slightly better understanding of what those two lives are, he thinks these are the finalists. They make it to the final round. They are the ones who he thinks meet all of the conditions or all of the criteria for the best sort of life that we could live. But importantly, he thinks that there is one of those two that even makes it past the final round and can be crowned the champion. Did you catch which one he thinks is the best one, the ultimate champion? He thinks that the final winner is, perhaps surprisingly, the contemplative life. He thinks that the contemplative life is even better choice than the life of active virtue. In what respect? He does think that both of those lives meet all of the conditions or criteria, but I think that there's one condition or criterion that the contemplative life meets better than the life of active virtue. And if you read Book 10, you'll see which condition that is. I guess I'll go ahead and tell you. The condition that he thinks the contemplative life meets better than the life of active virtue is he thinks that study is a more self-sufficient activity than being virtuous. So in order to exercise all your virtues, especially virtue like, I don't know, generosity or honesty or patience, notice that these virtues, in order to practice them, in order to exercise them, really do require other people. You can't be generous if you're stuck on a deserted island all by yourself. Who are you going to be generous to? And if you aren't generous, how are you going to get up to being generous if you don't have anyone to practice it on? But notice how he thinks you could engage in a kind of contemplative life on a deserted island all by yourself. It requires very little from the outside. In fact, contemplative life might be the only thing you could do on a deserted island. Maybe a life of amusement. But also he thinks the contemplative life, that you can focus on thinking about and coming to a deeper understanding of the structure of reality and our place in it. So he thinks the contemplative life in that way is more self-sufficient. It's something that you can do with fewer people, with fewer outside things. And so in that sense, the contemplative life edges out the life of active virtue only a little bit, only in terms of self-sufficiency. So is he really telling us, right, that every single one of us should pursue a contemplative life if we really want to be happy, that everyone else who isn't living the life of the mind is doomed to unhappiness? In some sense, the answer is yes. But I think there's a maybe a larger conclusion here, a larger lesson. I think the larger lesson is that Aristotle is telling us that everyone can pursue at least one of the two finalists for how we could live our lives. Everyone is capable of living either the life of active virtue or the contemplative life. He does think that the contemplative life is slightly better, so you should pursue that one if you can. But what would the world be like if we were all sort of theoretical physicists and religious and philosophers? How could the world survive? Well, it might be actually, in some sense, better if some of us, right, do engage in the life of active virtue. And Aristotle thinks this happens naturally. Not everybody can live the contemplative life. Not everyone sort of has like the natural aptitude for it. But in the end, though, right, even if we open it up such that you could live a very happy life living an life of active virtue, even if contemplative life is slightly better, even if we open it up to those two options, this does still narrow our options for what we can do with our lives. What Aristotle is saying here is that if you really want to be happy, if you really want to live a happy life, and it seems like we all do, we all recognize this very early on in Book 1, that happiness is what we're all after. And we want to know what sort of life we should live if we really want to be happy. He says, when it really comes down to it, if you want to be happy, you've only got two choices. Either, right, you dedicate yourself to becoming a better, morally better person. You work on developing your character, your virtue. You go out there and make the world a better place. Or you focus on developing your mind. You focus on growing in wisdom. You focus on expanding human knowledge of the universe and our place in it. When it comes down to it, he thinks that there's only really those two options in life. So what should you be doing with your life? You should be either serving, growing in virtue, or you should be growing in wisdom, learning, engaging in a life of study. Those are really the only two options that are available to us. Everything else, he thinks, is a dead end. Everything else is not going to make us nearly as happy as those two options. And so I think this is another key lesson from Aristotle. We wanted to know what is happiness and what should we be doing with our lives if we want to be happy. At the end of the day, his answer is we got those two options. I think this is an important question for us to consider, especially for you to consider, right? When you're thinking about your major, when you're thinking about what sort of profession you should pursue. Aristotle as academic advisor says, well, think about what the majors are that you could take, and think about what are the jobs that you could take. Think about the major you currently have. Think about the career path you currently have set out for yourself. Is there a sense in which the culmination, the endpoint of that course or that course of study, is it actually going to help you to develop your character to the fullest extent? Is it one that sets you on a path to growing in virtue? Is it one that sets you on a path to developing your mind, to growing in wisdom? If the answer to both of those questions is no, if your career path doesn't clearly involve you developing your moral virtue or your wisdom, Aristotle says, you may want to rethink that, because you want to be happy, don't you? If you're not going to be growing in virtue, if you're not going to be growing in wisdom, he thinks you're not likely to have the sort of happiness that you really desire. You're not making yourself, you're not setting yourself up for the greatest form of happiness that you're capable of. And he wants to say, well, why not? Right? If all of his arguments have been successful here, then it does show us that ultimately our lives should be ordered to either serving others or growing in wisdom. Now, of course, many of our lives hopefully will involve a little bit of both, at least. In order to serve others well, you have to learn a little bit about what other people need. You have to develop your mind at least to the extent that allow you to make good decisions. And also in the contemplative life, no one can live entirely separate from everyone else, even though it seems like we are doing that these days. You're still going to have some interactions with other people, and you're still going to need virtues in order to behave well towards those other people. So on the one hand, it looks like a choice between two sorts of lives, and it's a way in which we can consider on whether we're currently on the right course. But also maybe the answer is, well, why not both? Why can't you, right, develop both in virtue and wisdom? And indeed, that might be the best answer for what you should do with your life. Why not develop in both? Why not cover all the bases? Why not pursue the development of your nature most completely, including all the aspects of what you are? So that, I think, is the lesson from Book 10 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And indeed, I think that's the culmination of the argument of the whole book. He's talked to us about what he thinks the goal or purpose of human life is: happiness. But what is happiness? Well, here are the key ingredients, and here's the sort of life that I think you should live if you really want to be happy. Either the life of active virtue or the contemplative life. And any other life is bound to doom you to unhappiness. And so don't. Do yourself a favor and pursue one of those two lives. All right, still with me? Congratulations, you've made it all the way to the end of this video. Now what I want to talk about in the last couple minutes is I want to talk about your second argument analysis essay. Here is where you're going to be talking about his discussion of what sort of life we should live in Book 10. Though it also comes up, as we've seen, in Book 1 and a little bit in Book 2 as well. So let me talk you through the assignment. And here I'm just going to read off the description of the assignment that's present on your assignment sheet. So the primary purpose of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is to determine which sort of life we should try to live, and which goods or activities we should order our lives around if we want to be happy. Over the course of the book, Aristotle considers several different lives that human beings can choose to live, and several different goods or activities that we could choose to order our lives around. Famously, Aristotle argues that at most two ways of living our lives are likely to ever bring us true happiness: the life of active virtue and the life of contemplation. And of these two lives, he takes the life of contemplation to be superior, that is, the most conducive to true happiness. Aristotle's conclusions here are bold and controversial. He thinks that the nature of human happiness is something that can be determined by reason. He thinks that there is some general human happiness that applies to every one of us. He thinks that many people are gravely mistaken about what will make them happy. And his conclusion that the contemplative life is the life that is most likely to bring us true happiness strikes many readers as clearly misguided. For this assignment, you are to offer an analysis and assessment in 4 to 6 double-spaced pages of Aristotle's argument for the superiority of the contemplative life over all other lives. In your analysis of the argument, you should first describe what Aristotle sets out to do and his main strategy for achieving that goal. You should then discuss each life that he considers and the good or activity that such a life is ordered around. You should also introduce the main criteria by which he evaluates these lives, his main reasons for thinking that each of the lives that he rejects is unlikely to bring any human being true happiness, and his main reasons for thinking that the contemplative life is the best. So you're going to give me the rundown of both charts and how he's going to reason to conclude the contemplative life does best with all the conditions and the criteria. In the evaluation of your argument, I would like you to consider whether you agree with his conclusion and whether you think that his argument for that conclusion is sound. Has Aristotle overlooked alternatives or unfairly represented some opponents' views? Are his reasons for rejecting certain views likely to be persuasive to people of our day? Does Aristotle's argument need to be supplemented or modified in certain ways? Can you think of any ways to improve it, or is the argument entirely hopeless? I would also like you to consider how reflecting on Aristotle's conclusion might change the way that we live our lives today. What exactly is he asking us to do, and how different is that from how most human beings choose to live their lives today? Overall, I'm looking for a careful consideration of Aristotle's views on these issues, presented in a clear and concise manner, and well supported by the text, and a thoughtful reflection on the cogency and significance of his conclusions. Follow my guide on how to write a philosophy paper and how to do it well for help in writing this essay, which is available on Canvas. If you have any questions, please email me or stop by, email me, or we can do a video chat in order to walk you through it. So generally what you're doing for this essay assignment is you're walking me through how he reaches the conclusion that the contemplative life is the best sort of life that we can live, the one that is most conducive to happiness. It's going to involve going through the criteria, the conditions, and why he thinks that they're well motivated. It's going to be going through all the different candidates or the different contestants for what we could order our lives around, or how we could order our lives. And then I want to hear about all the different reasons he gives for thinking that some of the candidates are likely to be dead ends. And in fact, I'm also interested in your thoughts on, even if he doesn't make this case, it looks like based on his list of conditions or criteria, he ought to have also said that such and such a life fails to meet this condition. So the first stage is just analyzing it. Just here's what Aristotle's argument is. And the second part is your evaluation of it. Do you think this argument is any good? In other words, has he considered all the options? Are his arguments against certain options any good? Are his arguments in favor of the contemplative life, are they any good? Has he sort of shortchanged the life of active virtue? Or is there another life that you think that should actually be considered as better than the contemplative life? That's what I'm asking you to consider. And of course, I'm asking for a thoughtful reflection. If Aristotle were right, how would this force us to change the way in which we live our lives? What sort of expectations or behaviors would we have to change? How does reflecting on this sort of force you to change or force you to rethink your own life? Maybe it doesn't, but maybe it does. And I'd be interested in hearing about that in your essay. So now here at the end of Aristotle's Technique in Ethics, you have a total now of maybe 4 projects that you're working on. There are a few, I'm trying to remember, did I put 2 or 3? Well, anyway, there's several discussion topics on Canvas that you can contribute to. Some of them are sort of practice for your assignments or sharing sort of the fruits of your essays. You have 2 essays that you're working on. Your short reflection paper in which you're analyzing how a virtuous exemplar in your life and how your description of that person compares with Aristotle's description of such a person. In your second argument analysis essay, which I just described, you're analyzing his account of what sort of life he thinks that we should live and why. So that gives you plenty to work on. Of course, if you need help, right, if you have outlines, if you have questions about any of the assignments, please feel free to email me. We can arrange to have a video chat. We can talk you through it. I want to make sure you do well in these assignments and you get the most out of them. So best of luck on these, and keep me in the loop. Let me know how you're doing. Thanks very much.